Snow was still melting off Silvio Bellini's black wool coat when he stepped through the private side door near the wine cellar of the Greystone Mansion on Chicago's Gold Coast, a week early and unannounced. His dark hair still damp, the scar above his right brow catching the low light as his green eyes adjusted to the shadows. He'd cut the Detroit trip short because something had been gnawing at him for days, and all he'd wanted was to find his wife resting, to press his palm against the swell of her belly and feel their son kick, to apologize for being the kind of man who was always somewhere else. But his mother's voice reached him first, cold and precise, drifting from the study like frost creeping across glass. And what she said stopped him dead on the marble steps. Rosalind Bellini, silver hair pinned high, dressed in her usual smoke-gray silk, was telling the expectant mother in front of her that this child would never carry the Bellini name, not while she drew breath. And there stood Nova, 30 years old, chestnut hair loose around a face that had spent years staying calm through hospital emergencies. One hand gently protecting her swelling waistline, the other closed tight around a small brass compass pendant at her throat, the last thing her mother ever gave her before she passed. On the table between the two women sat an open envelope, a legal document marked in red, and a heavy fountain pen laid down deliberately, like a loaded gun waiting for a hand. Rosalind slid the paper forward and named a number large enough to make a woman disappear quietly. And Nova, a former emergency nurse who'd held dying strangers' hands without flinching, didn't raise her voice. She simply asked how many times the older woman had rehearsed this in front of her mirror. What neither of them knew, what Silvio himself didn't yet understand, was that the compass around Nova's neck wasn't just jewelry, and the name on that document wasn't the first name this family had tried to erase, and a truth buried under 30 years of silence was about to walk right through the front door. Because Nova hadn't married into this world by accident. And lately, she'd started asking questions no one wanted answered. Questions about a woman named Colette Marsh, a shuttered shipping company down at the harbor, and a photograph she wasn't supposed to find. Before we go any further, if a story about dignity, buried secrets, and a woman who refused to be erased is the kind of story you love, take a second to hit that like button, share this with someone who needs to hear it tonight, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Now let's step back inside that gray stone mansion, where a mother's cruelty and a quiet woman's courage are about to collide. And nothing in the Bellini family will ever be the same again. Silvio stood motionless for one more heartbeat on the marble steps. Then he set the suitcase down on the floor without a sound and strode forward, shoving the study door open with enough force to make it slam against the wall. The dry, brutal crack of impact making both women whip around. In that instant, every trace of color drained from Nova's face, but not because she felt relief at seeing her husband return. It was because of a shame so deep it hurt him more than any accusation ever could, as if she didn't want him to see her cornered like this. Rosalind, by contrast, only blinked once, then immediately put her flawless mask of composure back on, setting the pen down on the desk and smiling at her son as though he had just stepped into the middle of a peaceful Sunday afternoon tea. Her voice sweet as poured honey as she said, "He was home earlier than expected, and looked terribly tired after his trip." Silvio didn't answer his mother's gaze. His eyes moved slowly across everything on the desk, the opened envelope, the paper covered with harsh red marks, the heavy fountain pen lying there like a weapon that had just been set down, then stopped on his wife's trembling hand, which was pressed tightly against her collarbone as if it were the last anchor keeping her on her feet. When he spoke, his voice wasn't loud, but it was so cold that the air in the room seemed to harden around them. He said he had come home early enough to hear his own mother threaten to erase his unborn child's name from this family. Rosalind didn't flinch. She folded her hands before her chest, with the patient look of a mother forced to explain the obvious to a stubborn child, insisting that she was only doing what he should have done long ago, that this woman had entered their house with a purpose, and that there were things about her past he had never bothered to look into. But this time, Silvio cut his mother off, asking her plainly how long she had been sitting in this very room, under his roof, setting up this financial trap behind his back, and how many times she had smiled at Nova over dinner while keeping a piece of paper waiting in a drawer for her to sign. Rosalind only lifted her chin and replied that one day he would thank her for being clear-headed while he was blinded by emotion, that she had lived long enough to recognize who was sincere and who was merely waiting for a larger payment. It was then that Nova finally spoke, and her voice was so soft that both of them had to fall silent to hear it. She didn't deny anything, didn't beg, didn't shed a single tear. She only told the woman across from her that she could remove her name from every door in this house, could bribe every lawyer and every newspaper in the city, but she would never tear this child away from her, and that she had never, not even once, asked the Bellini family for a single dollar. Rosalind let out a dry laugh and slapped her palm against the glass desktop, making the pen roll slightly, accusing her of waiting for a much larger payout, a more worthy price for disappearing. Silvio looked at his mother as if, for the first time in his life, he was truly seeing her, seeing the calculated cruelty hidden beneath the charcoal-toned fabric and her perfectly arranged coiffure, and for one fleeting moment, he wondered how many other things about this family he had chosen not to see through all these years. Just as the air stretched tight as a string, about to snap, there came a hesitant knock at the door, and Marguerite, the housekeeper who had served the family for nearly 20 years, stepped inside with a bewildered expression and softly announced that there was an urgent call from an attorney named Weston Doyle, who said he needed to see Mrs. Nova immediately, and that it couldn't wait until morning. That name changed something in Rosalind's eyes, a flash of panic passing through them and vanishing so quickly that almost no one could have caught it. But Nova caught it, and for the first time in the entire confrontation, she was the calmest person in the room. She picked up her plain handbag from the chair, straightened herself, her posture rigid but dignified, then looked from her mother-in-law to her husband and said in a steady, unshakable voice that sometimes a woman chooses to walk away, not because she's weak or because she's giving up, but because she has finally understood that staying in a house that sees her as a price to be paid is only another way of willingly losing herself. Silvio took one step toward her, his lips parting as if to call his wife's name, as if to make her stay. But something in Nova's eyes stopped him, a quiet truth that the words he was about to say had come too late, that he had been absent too long, while she had faced all of this alone. She passed by him, close enough for him to smell the familiar scent in her hair, close enough to touch. But he didn't touch her, and she walked out through the study door, across the marble hallway where his suitcase still lay forgotten, then disappeared beyond the front door as it closed behind her with a small, soft click that echoed like a sentence handed down. In the room, with only mother and son left behind, Rosalind released a long breath as though a burden had just been lifted from her, and began saying something about how everything would be settled in time. But Silvio was no longer listening to her. His eyes were fixed on the paper, marked in red on the desk, and the unfamiliar name half visible in the corner of the page, a name he had never seen before. The taxi rolled through the streets of the Gold Coast, slick with melting snow, and Nova sat with her head resting against the cold window, her arms crossed over her chest, leaning slightly forward, as if she could use her own body as a shield to protect the child from everything that had just happened inside the gray stone house behind her. The city lights blurred through the tears she refused to let fall, the towering buildings, the glowing windows of other families, all of it drifting past like a world she had never truly belonged to, and in the silence of the ride, the thoughts she had tried to bury for months began rising to the surface, impossible to hold back. She remembered the day she met Silvio, not at some lavish party, but in the very emergency room where she worked, when he was brought in at midnight with a wound in his shoulder that he stubbornly insisted was an accident, and she had bandaged him with steady hands that didn't tremble, didn't pry into who he was, and saw only a human being in pain who needed care. She remembered the way he came back looking for her in the days that followed, the way he spoke to her as if she were the only person in the world who wanted nothing from him. And perhaps it was that rare sincerity, that made her allow herself to love a man her reason should have warned her to stay away from. But what Silvio didn't know, what no one in the Bellini family knew, was that Nova had entered this marriage carrying an ache that had been smoldering long before she ever met him, an unanswered question about her late mother, a woman named Colette Marsh, who had died alone and destitute just as Nova was entering adulthood, leaving behind heavy silences that Nova was then too young to truly understand. For years, she had believed her mother was only an unlucky woman, a devoted accountant, crushed by life beneath debts and a broken heart, until the day not long after the wedding, when she accidentally came across a name in the old papers of her husband's family, a name she had heard her mother whisper during the final nights of her life, and from that moment on, the ground beneath her feet had never felt solid in the same way again. She hadn't told Silvio, and that silence now pressed on her chest more heavily than Rosalind's threat, because she knew that a woman carrying a man's child while secretly investigating his own family was not something easily forgiven. And she was afraid so numbingly afraid, that the day the truth came into the light would also be the day she lost everything she had only just begun to have. She loved Silvio. That was something she couldn't deny, no matter how hard she tried. She loved the way he placed his hand on her belly every night and whispered to their unborn child. Loved even his clumsy silences when he didn't know what to say to comfort her. But that love was now being torn apart by a doubt she couldn't extinguish, by the question of whether the man she loved carried in his blood the very sin that had destroyed her mother's life. She instinctively reached for the small brass pendant, the last keepsake her mother had left behind, and she felt the cold brass press into her palm, the back of it seeming slightly loose beneath her fingers. But in the turmoil of this night, she didn't pay attention to it, and only held on to it as if she were holding her mother's hand from the other side of separation. She remembered what her mother had told her when she was little, that she must always find her own true north, and never let anyone with a grand family name convince her she was beneath them. And it was that very lesson that had made her stand straight before Rosalind tonight, instead of lowering her head and signing the paper. But now, alone in the darkness of the taxi, she allowed herself to be weak for a moment, wondering whether her resilience was only another form of loneliness, whether searching for the truth about her mother was worth trading away the home she and Silvio had tried to build, and whether the child inside her would grow up in a family mended by the truth, or torn apart by that very truth. The name Weston Doyle echoed in her mind, the attorney who had called urgently tonight, a man who had quietly approached her years ago after her mother's passing, claiming to be an old acquaintance just to offer his silent support. And she understood that the call hadn't been a coincidence, that somehow the threads of the past were tightening around her at the very moment when she was most fragile. When the taxi turned onto the familiar road leading back toward Pilsen, carrying her farther from the cold wealth of the Gold Coast, Nova felt her tense shoulders finally loosen just a little, because she understood that she wasn't running away like a coward. She was only returning to the one place where her history didn't need an invitation card engraved in gold to be allowed to exist. The place where she could be both a wife coming apart and a daughter still searching for her mother in the darkness of all the things left unsaid. The familiar street welcomed Nova, with the warm yellow light spilling from the bakery window downstairs, and even in the freezing night, she could still smell the faint scent of baked dough and cinnamon in the air, the same scent that had followed her through childhood and now still felt like a pair of open arms waiting to bring her home. The small apartment above the bakery had faded walls, an old elevator that acted up now and then, and a hallway that always carried the smell of freshly brewed coffee from the neighbor's place. All those humble details whose warmth no amount of Bellini family money could ever buy. The moment she stepped out of the taxi, a clear little voice called her name from the bakery steps, and when Nova looked up, she saw Milo, the 6-year-old boy who lived with his grandmother in the apartment at the end of the hall, sitting there waiting for her with a picture book open on his lap and a smile that showed the front tooth he had just lost. The boy rushed toward her, his dark eyes shining with joy, and Nova felt her heavy heart soften for an instant, because Milo was one of the first children she had cared for when she was still a nurse in the emergency room, a small, fragile boy she had sat beside through so many long nights, and even now, every week, he still waited for her as though he were waiting for someone in his own family. Milo innocently asked whether the baby in her belly knew how to kick yet, whether the baby would like the cookies his grandmother made, and he held out a drawing he had made for the baby, a picture of a small house with 3 people standing hand in hand beneath a round, bright yellow sun, making Nova bite down hard on her lip so she wouldn't break down before such purity. She sat on the step beside him, not caring about the cold, and listened as he told her about his day with all the breathless excitement of a child, about the stray cat he had fed, about the math problem he had gotten right. And in that moment, Nova was reminded of who she had been before she stepped into the world of gray stone mansions and papers slashed with red marks. A woman whose hands knew how to heal, not a name someone wanted to erase. Milo's grandmother came to the door and called him in for dinner, nodding to Nova with the gentle eyes of someone who understood far too much about quiet burdens. And Nova hugged the boy goodbye, promised she would keep the drawing safe, then watched Milo's small figure disappear behind the door with a tenderness that made her chest ache. When she reached the apartment, she opened the familiar door and stepped into the space where everything was still kept the way it had been when her mother was alive. The wooden chair by the window, the notebooks arranged neatly on the shelf, and on the small dining table, the framed photograph of her mother smiling brightly on a windswept beach, wearing the very compass necklace that now rested at Nova's throat. She set her handbag down, took off the necklace, and held it in her palm under the lamplight. Her finger once again touched the slightly loose place on the back that she had vaguely felt in the car, and for a second, she meant to turn it over and see whether the hinge had worn down with age, but just then the long, relentless day came crashing down on her shoulders like a wave, and she only pressed the necklace tightly to her chest, telling herself she would take it to be repaired another day, when her mind wasn't as tangled as it was tonight. She sank into her mother's chair, letting exhaustion seep into every fiber of her body, and for the first time since leaving the mansion, she allowed the tears to roll down her face, crying not because of Rosalind's predictable cruelty, but because of something far more painful. Because when Silvio stepped into that room, his love had arrived wearing the face of astonishment instead of certainty, as if he, too, had to weigh who she was, and that brief hesitation, fleeting as it had been, had cracked her heart in a way no threat ever could. She was sitting there, sunk deep in the loneliness of the silent apartment, when her phone buzzed with an urgent voicemail notification from Weston Doyle, left minutes after she had walked out of the mansion. Dialing in with a trembling hand, she listened to the old attorney's hoarse voice, heavy with a raw worry she had never heard from him before, as he said her mother had made him promise to wait until the right time. But now, Rosalind Bellini knew too much, and the ruthless money offer tonight proved that Nova's pregnancy had completely changed the shape of a game that had begun before she was even born. He urgently told her not to sign anything bearing the Bellini name, not even out of some misplaced tenderness for a husband who still didn't understand, and said they needed to meet first thing the next morning, because there were things about her mother that Nova finally needed to know, things he had kept hidden for 30 years under the weight of a remorse that had never left him. While Nova sat silently listening to Weston Doyle's hoarse voice in the warm apartment in Pilsen, many miles away, in the cold study of the gray stone mansion, Silvio still stood rooted before the paper slashed with red marks, his eyes fixed on the unfamiliar name, half visible in the corner of the page. A name that sounded like the name of a company, Marsh and Vessel, one he was certain he had never heard in all the years he had been raised to one day inherit the family empire. Rosalind was still saying something about how he would understand someday, that she did everything for him, but her voice began to falter when she realized her son was no longer listening, that his gaze had locked onto the paper in a way that sent a chill down her spine. Silvio reached for the document, and it was then that he noticed beneath it, carelessly hidden under a glossy magazine at the corner of the desk, a hard-covered file folder yellowed by the years, something Rosalind had clearly brought out in preparation for tonight's meeting, but had forgotten to put away in the confusion caused by his sudden appearance. He hadn't even touched it yet when Rosalind's hand shot out to snatch it back with a speed astonishing for her age, and that very frantic haste, that look in her eyes in that instant, told Silvio more than anything she had ever said, that whatever was inside this folder frightened her even more than the fact that he had overheard her threat moments earlier. He caught his mother's wrist, not roughly, but with such firmness that she couldn't pull free, and in a voice that had lost every trace of a son's warmth, he ordered her to let go, saying that if she had nothing to hide, there was no reason to fight over a stack of old papers. For a moment, mother and son looked straight into each other's eyes, and in his mother's gray eyes, Silvio saw something he had never seen in all his life. Not her usual cold authority, but the naked fear of a woman watching the wall she had spent so long building begin to crack. And it was that which made her trembling hand loosen. Silvio pulled the file toward himself, and Rosalind stepped back, her voice suddenly hurried and pleading in a way that was utterly foreign to the woman she was, saying there were doors that, once opened, could never be closed again, that he should trust her, and let the past sleep where it belonged. But Silvio opened the folder beneath the desk lamp, and what appeared before his eyes made his breath stop in his chest. Inside was a faded copy of an old birth certificate, pages of dense handwritten notes bearing the heading Marsh and Vessel, and one half of a photograph that had been torn in two. He picked up this first half of the photograph with fingers that had suddenly become clumsy, and in the yellowed image, he recognized a much younger version of a man whose face he had only seen once in his mother's oldest, locked album Julian Vance, his mother's first love and the fiancé she was forced to abandon before marrying into the Bellini family, looking longingly toward the torn edge of the frame where someone had been cut out. Yet, right at the tear line, the unmistakable edge of a brass compass necklace was clearly visible, identical to the one Nova wore every day, the very necklace her hand had gripped tonight as though it were her last anchor. Silvio's head snapped up toward his mother, and in that moment, All the scattered pieces began to collide inside his mind. The way she had gone pale when she saw the necklace on Nova's throat earlier, the unnatural hatred she held for a woman who had never harmed anyone, the name Marsh and Vessel, and the terrified gaze she was now fixing on the photograph in his hand. He asked his mother, in a low and dangerous voice, who the woman in the photograph was, why Julian was standing beside her, and why she was wearing his wife's necklace. But Rosalind only shook her head, her lips pressed into a hard, straight line, refusing to answer even a single question. Silvio set the photograph down on the desk and stepped closer to his mother, and for the first time in his life, he spoke to her in the cold voice he used in rooms where people didn't dare defy him. He said that for all these months, she had sat in this house calling his wife a gold digger, an opportunist, a woman with no trustworthy past, while she herself was the one hiding an entire vault of erased history beneath the glossy magazines on her own desk. Rosalind still said nothing. She only stood there with her hands clasped so tightly together they had gone white, and her silence, the silence of a woman who had decided she would rather carry a secret to the grave than admit it, was the fullest answer Silvio needed. An answer confirming that the dark-haired woman in the photograph was not some accidental stranger, but a link in a truth this entire family had worked to bury long before he was old enough to ask questions. It was late at night when Nova finally ended the call with Weston Doyle, and the old attorney's hoarse warning still echoed in her mind. Don't sign anything. There are things about your mother you need to know. 30 years of remorse that has never stopped aching. She couldn't bring herself to sleep on the small sofa. And after hours of tossing and turning, listening to the old elevator groan and the footsteps of residents coming home late in the building, she sat up and walked to the bookshelf where her mother had once kept the things most precious to her. For a long time, she had known about the sealed envelope hidden behind her mother's notebooks, a letter Colette had left for her daughter, but Nova had never been brave enough to open it because she was afraid of what it might contain, afraid that once she read it, she would no longer be able to live with the gentle image of her mother she had built in order to protect herself. But tonight, after everything that had happened inside the Greystone mansion, after seeing the flash of panic on Rosalind's face when Weston Doyle's name was spoken, she understood that the time for running away was over, and she sat beneath the warm yellow light, trembling as she peeled open the seal stained by the years. Her mother's slender, slanting handwriting appeared on the page, so familiar that Nova had to press the letter against her chest for a moment before she could read it. And when she began, her mother's voice seemed to come alive in every word, gentle, yet carrying a pain she had never allowed her daughter to see while she was alive. Colette wrote that she had once loved a man she should never have loved, a love that had been impossible from the beginning, but the greatest mistake of her life had not been that love. It had been placing her trust in people who constantly preached about honor and family dignity, while coldly trading human lives behind closed doors. She wrote about a small shipping company by the Chicago docks, a business the Marsh family had built with sweat over generations, and about how it had been taken from them under pressure so ruthless and so refined that it left behind no trace that could be brought into the light, and she begged her daughter never to let anyone convince her that being born far from power meant being born without the right to be a person. Line after line confirmed the very fear Nova had carried for months, ever since the day she accidentally came across that name in her husband's family papers. And though she had suspected it for so long, seeing the truth appear in her mother's own handwriting still struck her with a pain that was both relieving and numbing, because now she could no longer lie to herself that all of it was only coincidence. She understood that the woman from the past her mother had written about, the woman crushed by a powerful family at the docks, was Colette, and that family bore the Bellini name, the same name the child in her womb was about to be born to inherit. Her tears fell onto the letter, blurring one corner of the page, and she hurried to wipe them away, afraid of damaging the last words her mother had left behind. But she wasn't crying because of the Bellini family's cruelty, something she now understood all too well. She was crying because of something more private and far more painful. She remembered the massive shadow of the Bellini family that now hung over her child's future, a weight that felt heavier than any of Rosalind's cruelest threats. She had loved Silvio, believing their bond was an unshakable sanctuary, immune to the poisonous whispers of his world. Yet tonight she understood that the battle ahead would test everything they had built. She wondered how their marriage could withstand the sudden collision of their two worlds, and she held her mother's letter against her chest, sitting still in the silent apartment, feeling alone between two people who were gone and one person who was still alive, yet whom she no longer dared to believe she truly understood. But even inside that loneliness, her mother's words still burned quietly within her like a small flame that refused to go out, that she had to find her own true north. And Nova knew that whatever tomorrow brought, she would no longer run from the truth. She would follow it to the very end, not for revenge, but so she could finally return to her mother the name and dignity that others had tried to erase. The next morning, after a night with almost no sleep, and the Marsh and Vessel file spread across the oak desk in the study, Silvio stood beside the tall window looking out over the cold gray surface of Lake Michigan, and for the first time in many years, he felt the solid foundation of the world he had been born into begin to shift beneath his feet. He had spent the whole morning thinking, not only about the dark-haired woman in the torn photograph, but about the very path he had been quietly pursuing since the day he inherited the family's power, because Silvio Bellini wasn't like the father who had built this empire, and he wasn't like the mother who was trying so desperately to hold it inside the dark. For the past 3 years, ever since he took the seat at the head of it all, he had quietly but firmly pulled the family away from the shadowed dealings that had fed it for decades, turning each yard, each fleet, each shipping contract into a legal and transparent machine, signing agreements with legitimate business partners, people who saw in Bellini only a growing logistics corporation, not the name that had once made people lower their voices when they spoke it. It was a slow and dangerous transformation, and not everyone in the family welcomed it. The fiercest opponent, the one who always tried to block him at every step, was none other than Rosalind, his mother, the woman who believed true power existed only in darkness, and that the clean light he was chasing was nothing more than a dangerous innocence that would one day destroy everything the family had built. She had warned him many times that some things should never be brought into the light, that certain doors were closed for a reason, and that morning, as those words echoed in his head alongside the memory of panic on her face the night before, Silvio began to wonder whether those warnings had truly been about the family's future, or about a past she was terrified would return. His eyes drifted, almost by accident, to the large portrait of his father hanging on the study wall. The man with green eyes so much like his own, and a calm smile Silvio still remembered with painful clarity, and a familiar emptiness rose in his chest as he thought of the day he lost him. For years, Silvio had believed his father was just like the rest of them, a cold conqueror who built an empire on ruthless calculations. People had said he died of a sudden heart attack in the middle of the night, when he was not yet 60 and still as strong as a man 10 years younger. A death the entire family had accepted as a tragedy of fate, and Silvio, too young and too grief-stricken then, had never thought to question it. But looking at that calm smile now, a sudden, piercing doubt struck him. Had he truly known the man behind the legacy? Or had he spent his whole life believing a carefully constructed lie? But this morning, standing among the pages of a file revealing that his family and the tragic Julian Vance had once had some connection to the woman with the compass necklace and that erased shipping company, a vague and uneasy thought crept into his mind for the first time. A question he didn't yet dare to name, whether those who came before him and his father had carried some dark family secret to the grave that someone had not wanted them to reveal. He pushed the thought aside, telling himself that he was letting his imagination run too far after a sleepless night. But the seed of doubt had already been planted, and Silvio understood it wouldn't easily disappear. Rosalind entered the study at that very moment, still dressed in immaculate slate-colored couture, as though nothing had happened the night before, and she looked at the file on the desk with a sharp, icy gaze, demanding that he stop digging into the past of an opportunistic woman at once, saying that he was placing his entire career and the whole family in danger because of a passing infatuation. But Silvio turned and looked at his mother with eyes that had changed, the eyes of a man who had just realized that everything he had been taught to believe might be only a coat of paint over something rotting underneath, and he told her in a low, steady, unforgiving voice that for the past 3 years he had been trying to bring this family out of the darkness, so his son could grow up without carrying the weight of sins he had never committed, and he wouldn't stop merely because she was afraid of the light. Rosalind looked at her son for a long while, and in that moment, something almost like grief passed through her gray eyes, as though she were seeing in him the very man she had lost many years before. Then she turned and walked out, leaving behind a soft but threatening sentence, that there were truths which, once dragged into the light, would burn even the one searching for them, and Silvio remained alone in the study, feeling the shadow of the family whose name he carried pressing down on his shoulders more heavily than ever before. That afternoon, instead of going to the office as usual, Silvio drove the dark car himself down to the old docks on the south side of the city, following the address he had traced from the handwritten notes in the file, and he stopped in front of an administrative building that had long since been abandoned, its windows boarded over, the marsh and vessel sign so rusted and peeling that it was almost impossible to read. The cold wind blowing in from the lake carried the smell of brine and rusted iron, and Silvio stood there for a long while, looking at the corpse of an enterprise his family had swallowed many years before, feeling a vague unease rise inside him as he thought that the very fleets and yards that had built the wealth he inherited might have been raised on the foundations of ruined places like this one. He was about to turn away when a hoarse voice spoke from behind him, and when he turned, he saw an older man with silver hair and a worn protective coat, a man who introduced himself as Bruno Alcott, the person hired to look after this abandoned property all these years, someone who had once worked as the dock manager here back when the place was still alive with ships coming and going. When Silvio mentioned the name, Marsh, something changed in the old man's eyes, a flicker of caution as he recognized the expensive suit and the family name this young man carried. But when Silvio said he had come not to threaten anyone but to learn the truth, Bruno sighed and invited him into the small guardroom, where he brewed a pot of strong black coffee. He told Silvio about the old days, about how the Marsh family had built this shipping company with their own hands and their own decency, about the way they treated the longshoremen like family, paying fair wages even through slow seasons, and about a woman named Colette, whose name made his voice soften with affection every time he spoke it. Bruno said Colette wasn't anything like anyone's idea of an opportunist or a threat, but a kind and resilient woman, an accountant precise down to every number, yet always the first to defend the workers who had no voice, the one who still brought bread and hot coffee down to the docks for the night shift during the bitter cold of winter. Silvio sat in silence and listened, his fingers tightly tracing the rim of his porcelain mug, and with every story Bruno told, the image of the dark-haired woman in the torn photograph became more vivid and real, no longer an abstract mystery but a living, breathing person who had once lived, loved, and been respected in this very place. Then Bruno's voice dropped lower, filled with hesitation as though he were touching something he had never dared put into words all these years, and he said that in the final days before the company was transferred and Colette disappeared from the docks, people whispered that she had been driven to the end of the road, that someone had forced her to leave in tears and humiliation, stripped not only of the business but of her dignity, and that she had gone without anyone who loved her ever getting the chance to say goodbye. He said that all these years, he had still been haunted by the fact that he had done nothing to help her, that he had lowered his head and stayed silent when powerful men came and erased everything, and he looked straight into Silvio's eyes as he said that people like her deserved to be remembered, not wiped out of history as if they had never existed. Every word from Bruno fell on Silvio like drops of acid eating through the shell he had lived inside all his life, and a deep, suffocating shame rose in his chest, a shame that wasn't his alone but belonged to an entire bloodline, as he realized that the wealth he had grown up inside, the lavish parties, the warm rooms, the prestigious university degree, all of it might have been paid for with lives like Colette's, decent people crushed so his family could rise. He thanked Bruno in a hoarse voice, and before leaving, he stood in silence a little longer before the ruined building, looking at the rusted sign as though he were looking at an unnamed gravestone, and for the first time in his life, Silvio Bellini felt that the name he carried wasn't a source of pride but a burden, a debt he didn't yet know how to repay. But he knew one thing with certainty. He couldn't turn his back and pretend he had never heard this story, that the path he had begun 3 years earlier to bring his family into the light had now become something far deeper and far more urgent than he had ever imagined. The next morning, when Nova opened the apartment door to go downstairs to the bakery and buy a warm loaf of bread, as she did every early morning, she froze on the threshold, because right before the step, placed neatly on the old, worn doormat, was a large bouquet carefully wrapped in spotless white cellophane. For a moment, her heart beat faster with the innocent thought that perhaps Silvio had sent flowers to make peace. But when she bent down and looked more closely, a cold sensation spread along her spine, because these weren't roses or bright fresh flowers people sent to express love, but white lilies and white chrysanthemums arranged in the shape of a wreath, the kind of flowers people placed before coffins at funerals. There was no card with the sender's name, only a white ribbon laid across it, and on that ribbon, in neat, cold block letters, was a short line saying that wise women knew when to leave quietly, and that this city could be very cruel to those who refused to understand that. Nova stood frozen, one hand gripping the doorframe to keep her balance, the other instinctively moving to shield her child. And she felt the sudden panic tightening in her chest in the cold morning air, because she understood at once that this wasn't a joke or a mistake, but a carefully calculated warning, a message sent by a hand powerful enough to find her hidden address, and cruel enough to choose this chillingly refined form of threat. She lifted her eyes and looked around the familiar street. The street she had always believed was safe, her final refuge away from the world of the Bellini family. And now every dark window, every parked car, every passing shadow suddenly became suspicious in her eyes, and for the first time, she understood with terrifying clarity that she was being watched, that someone had followed every step she had taken since leaving the mansion, knew where she had gone, knew where she lived, knew even the small street she had thought no one would ever notice. She thought immediately of Rosalind, of that woman's cold gaze, and her hand so accustomed to manipulating everything from the darkness, and she realized that this was exactly Rosalind's way, cruelty wrapped in a polished shell of courtesy, a threat that left behind no fingerprint that could be traced. Just as, according to what her mother had written in the letter, they had once crushed Colette without leaving a mark. Nova bent down and picked up the funeral flowers with trembling hands, and for one moment, anger rose up and overwhelmed her fear, because she understood exactly what the sender of this bouquet wanted. They wanted her afraid, wanted her to shrink back and run, wanted her to believe that her small life could never stand against an empire, wanted her to vanish quietly, the way her mother had once been forced to vanish. But in the very moment she touched those cold flowers, something hard inside Nova was forged even stronger, because she thought of her mother, of the gentle woman by the docks, who had been driven to the end of the road alone, with no one standing up to protect her, and she told herself that she wouldn't let history repeat itself with her, that she wouldn't allow fear to turn her into another name erased from the page. She carried the bouquet inside, not to display it, but to keep it as evidence, placing it on the table beside her mother's framed photograph, and in the morning light falling through the window, the two images beside each other became a silent reminder of what was being threatened and what was worth fighting for. She took out her phone, intending to call Weston Doyle and tell him about the bouquet, but her hand stopped midway when another thought came to her, that if whoever stood behind this already knew her address this well, perhaps they were also watching her calls and her connections, and she realized with cold clarity that from now on, she would have to be careful with every step, every word, every person she trusted. She set the phone down, drew in a deep breath to steady her pounding heart, and stood by the window looking down at the familiar Pilsen Street now stained with unease. Nova understood that the battle she was about to enter was no longer only between her and her husband's mother, but a confrontation with an entire force that had used fear as a weapon for so many years, and that to protect the child in her womb and return honor to her mother, she would have to become braver than she had ever believed herself capable of being. That morning, Nova went to Weston Doyle's office as arranged, and she didn't know that Silvio, after a restless night with everything Bruno Alcott had told him, had followed the same thread and arrived at that very address, a modest law office on the second floor of an old building downtown, far from the steel and glass towers where the Bellini family's attorneys usually worked. When Silvio stepped inside, he stopped short when he saw his wife already seated in the room, and in that bewildered moment, the two of them looked at each other with astonishment tangled with hesitation, because neither had expected to find the other here, and that very coincidence revealed to Silvio something he had never foreseen, that the path in search of the truth, the one he thought he had only just begun, was a path Nova had been walking in silence for a long time. The old attorney sat behind a wooden desk, piled high with files, his hair white as snow and his sharp eyes hidden behind thick glasses. And when Silvio politely held out his hand in greeting, Weston Doyle only looked at that hand for a long while and refused to take it, placing his own hands together on the desk with an unshaken firmness, saying that in this room, the Bellini name and the vast fortune behind it spoke far more quietly than the weight of documents and buried injustices. Silvio lowered his hand, and instead of taking offense as the instinct of a man used to being respected might have told him to do, he accepted that coldness as something he deserved, pulling out a chair and sitting beside Nova, without daring to look directly into her eyes. Weston opened a thick folder with worn edges, and in the steady, hoarse voice of a man who had lived too long with a secret, he began laying before them the entire history of Marsh and Vessel, telling them how a small but steady shipping company, built by the Marsh family, had been taken over by the Bellini Empire Many years earlier, through a chain of refined schemes, loans arranged only so they could later be called in, contracts deliberately broken, and relentless pressures that slowly drained a healthy enterprise until it was forced to sell itself for a pitiful price. He said Colette Marsh had been the indirect heir to that company, and that her signature, giving up every right, had been obtained under deeply murky circumstances, when she had been completely isolated, pushed into poverty and despair until she had no real choice left. A signature that, according to Weston, couldn't be considered voluntary under any true meaning of justice. Silvio listened without moving a muscle in his face, his jaw clenched tight, and with every detail Weston revealed, he understood more clearly that this wasn't the story of an ordinary business transaction, but a crime carried out in a cold and organized manner. And what unsettled him most was the old attorney's strangely thorough knowledge, because Weston didn't only know the major events. He knew the smallest details as well, the exact dates, the names, the hidden clauses in the documents, a depth of understanding that seemed to reach far beyond what a simple family friend could possibly possess. There was a moment when Silvio looked up at him with a flicker of suspicion, wondering how an outsider could know so much about the most carefully concealed dealings of his family. But Weston calmly avoided that gaze and continued turning to the next page of the file, leaving the question hanging in the air without an answer. But what hurt Silvio most that morning wasn't the family's sins slowly coming into view. It was the realization that the woman sitting quietly beside him, the wife he had believed he understood, had carried all of this inside her for a long time, without ever saying a word to him. He turned to look at Nova, and in her eyes he read the silent confession that yes, she had known, she had investigated, she had hidden it from him, and a feeling that was both betrayal and shame rose inside him, because he didn't know whether he should be angry with her for staying silent, or blame himself for creating a marriage in which his wife couldn't trust him enough to share the greatest pain of her life. When Weston closed the file and said there was still more that would gradually be revealed when the time was right, Silvio walked out of the office with an invisible but cold distance between him and Nova, a thin crack newly formed in the trust between them, and the two of them stood in silence on the sidewalk beneath the gray Chicago sky, close enough to touch yet as far apart as two people who had just realized they had both been carrying the same secret in completely different ways, and that to mend the distance between them, they would have to pass through much more than the truth about the past. That afternoon, while Nova sat in a small cafe on a quiet corner near Pilsen, and find some way to mend the cold distance that had just opened between them, her phone began vibrating again and again, with a flood of urgent notifications, and when she opened the screen, her whole body went cold as she read the sensational headline, spreading at dizzying speed across the gossip sites that fed on the private lives of Chicago's upper class. The article was signed by Delphine Kerr, a well-known writer famous for covering scandals among the rich, and it painted a carefully staged and vicious story, describing the young pregnant wife of a powerful family who had walked out in the middle of the night, demanded a luxurious penthouse, and was using her unborn child as a bargaining chip to drain millions of dollars from her distinguished in-laws. Every sentence had been weighed to smear her with subtle precision, turning her from a woman who had been cornered into a cold, calculating schemer, and Nova immediately recognized the familiar mark in this method, the way an enemy's reputation could be destroyed without leaving behind a single fingerprint that could be traced. It was exactly Rosalind's way, the way of the woman who had sent funeral flowers to Nova's door. She understood that this wasn't a random article, but a carefully calculated move, a first strike meant to shape public opinion before any truth about Colette and Marsh and Vessel could come into the light, a way to make Nova guilty in the eyes of the public before she ever had a chance to speak. Only a few minutes later, her phone vibrated again, this time with a call from Silvio, and when she answered, she heard in his voice an anger boiling so fiercely he could barely contain it. He said he had just received a series of panicked messages from his communications advisors, that he knew exactly who was behind this, and that he would call every newsroom at once, would use every ounce of power and every connection the Bellini name possessed to crush the article and the person who had written it. Nova heard his hurried footsteps, heard him ordering someone to prepare the car, and she understood that he was on the edge of an impulsive act that could destroy everything. So she drew in a deep breath and, in a calm but urgent voice, told him to stop, not to call anyone, not to do anything right now. Silvio went still on the other end of the line, unable to understand why his wife was stopping him from protecting her, and Nova explained to him what years of working in chaotic emergency rooms had taught her, that you can't win a crisis by rushing into it in a panic. That Rosalind had released this article not because she believed it would stand against the truth, but precisely because she wanted to provoke a violent reaction. She told him that if he stormed into newsrooms with the fury of a powerful boss, threatening and applying pressure, then he would only be giving Rosalind exactly what she needed, an image of the Bellini family as aggressive and violent, living proof to support the lying story that they were people who used money and power to silence others, and in that way, she would turn his righteous anger itself into a weapon against both of them. Silvio was silent for a long time, and Nova could hear his heavy breathing as anger slowly gave way to reason, as he gradually realized that his wife, the woman the whole city was now smearing, was the one who was calmest and clearest among them all. She told him that for too long, she had let other people tell the story of who she was, had let those with money and power define her worth and her dignity, and that she wouldn't do that one more time, but the way she would fight back would not be with power or threats, but with the one thing Rosalind and the world she belonged to could never counterfeit, the bare truth from Nova's own mouth. When she ended the call after Silvio reluctantly agreed not to act until he saw her, Nova sat silently in the small cafe, looking out at the cold gray street beyond the window, and a decision slowly took clear shape in her mind, a decision so simple and so bold that even she felt her heart beat faster. She would speak for herself, not through an attorney, not through a spokesperson, not through any protective layer of power, but with her own real face and her own real voice, and she put her phone into her bag, stood, and walked out of the cafe with the new calm of someone who had just found her own road. That very evening, inside her quiet apartment in Pilsen, Nova set up a simple camera beneath the warm light of the desk lamp, right beside her mother's photograph. She didn't use a script, nor did she disguise her exhaustion. She simply looked directly into the lens and spoke the truth about Colette Marsh, the ruined shipping company at the docks, and the 30-year cycle of corporate cruelty that was now threatening her own unborn child. Her voice was steady, free of malice but heavy with undeniable dignity, as she laid out the facts that the Bellini family had spent decades trying to bury. When she finished, she uploaded the video directly to the public domain, refusing to let money or power gatekeep her story any longer. The internet did the rest. 2 days after the video spread across the city, Milo came up to Nova's apartment in the late afternoon with his grandmother, who brought her a box of cinnamon cookies fresh from the oven and a pot of hot coffee, the simple, earthy kindness of neighbors who had come to see her as family. While Milo's grandmother sat talking with Nova at the small dining table, the boy wandered around the room, looking at the familiar objects, and his curious eyes stopped on the compass necklace Nova had taken off and placed on the bookshelf beside her mother's framed photograph, the brass face glinting beneath the lamplight and filling him with delight. The boy turned back and asked Nova if he could look at the necklace, and Nova smiled and nodded, because she trusted him and knew that the clear curiosity of a child never carried any malice, so she let him hold the necklace carefully in his small hands, examining the tiny compass needle and the faded engravings on the brass face. Milo turned the necklace this way and that with fascination, watching the compass needle move, asking Nova whether the needle really pointed north, and she was about to explain it to him when, as he passed the necklace from one hand to the other, his small, clumsy fingers let it slip, and it fell to the wooden floor, striking the boards with a dry little click. The boy immediately panicked, his dark eyes widening with guilt, apologizing in a flustered rush as he bent down to pick up the necklace. But Nova gently reassured him that it was all right, that it was only a small accident, and she wasn't angry, and she bent down beside him to pick it up with him. But when Nova lifted the necklace, she realized that the impact had knocked loose the back piece she had felt moving slightly for so long whenever she touched it, the part she had meant to have repaired so many times but had kept putting off, and now it had sprung open to reveal something she had never imagined. A tiny hidden compartment concealed behind the compass face, an empty space she hadn't known existed in all the years she had worn this necklace close to her body. Nova's heart began pounding as she saw that inside the secret compartment was something folded with extraordinary care and precision. A thin piece of paper yellowed by the years, rolled tightly and tucked into the narrow space, with the tenderness of someone who had wanted to hide it from the entire world. Milo's grandmother, sensing the change in the air, gently called the boy back to her so Nova could have the quiet she needed, and Nova shakily placed the necklace on the table, using the tip of her finger to ease the fragile paper out of its hiding place, moving with the greatest care as if she feared it might crumble in her hand. When she unfolded it beneath the lamplight, she realized it wasn't a letter, but something much smaller and far more mysterious. A slip of paper bearing numbers and symbols in her mother's familiar handwriting, along with a short line hinting at some hiding place. A coded clue Colette had deliberately hidden in the most private place she could find, right inside the piece of jewelry she knew her daughter would always wear close to her. Nova sat frozen. In that moment, all the scattered pieces collided in her mind with a breathtaking clarity. The mystery that had haunted her for so long was finally unraveled. She now understood why, on that fateful night in the Greystone mansion, Rosalind's face had gone pale upon glimpsing the compass necklace at her throat. Rosalind hadn't feared the necklace because it was the keepsake of a woman she hated. She feared it because she knew, or at least suspected, that Colette had hidden something, and that the thing the entire Bellini family had hunted and feared for 30 years, the evidence that could expose everything, might have been right before their eyes all along, worn innocently around the neck of the daughter they were trying to drive away. Nova pressed the piece of paper to her chest, trembling and so moved that tears rose in her eyes, because she realized how wise and brave her mother had been, how deeply she had trusted and loved her, when she placed in her hands the key to a truth she herself hadn't lived long enough to unlock. And she looked over at Milo, sitting obediently beside his grandmother, silently thanking the pure clumsiness of the boy that had accidentally opened a door Nova hadn't known she had been carrying with her all these years. The next morning, Nova had arranged to meet Weston Doyle, so the two of them could look into the coded clue on the piece of paper found inside the compass necklace, an important meeting that might open the next chapter of the entire investigation. But just as she was preparing to leave the apartment, Milo's grandmother called with a voice full of embarrassment, saying that today was the day the boy had to go to the hospital for the routine health checkup he had been keeping up with for so long. But she had just twisted her ankle and couldn't take him herself, and she didn't know who else to ask. Nova didn't hesitate for even 1 second. She immediately called Weston back to move the appointment to the afternoon, because in her heart, taking a child she loved to his doctor's visit mattered more than any clue or investigation, and that was the instinct that had rooted itself deep inside her from her years as a nurse. The instinct that always placed a person who needed her above everything else. She went to pick up Milo, and the boy chattered happily when he saw that she was the one taking him, holding her hand the whole way to the hospital, telling her all kinds of stories about the stray cat and the pictures he was drawing, and Nova listened to him with a gentle smile, setting aside for a while all the storms closing in around her life, so she could give her full attention to the clear joy of the child beside her. At the hospital, she sat with Milo in the waiting room, helped him fill out the forms, spoke with the old nurses she had once worked alongside with the warmth of someone who belonged to that world, and patiently stayed beside him through the entire checkup, holding his hand and soothing him with a soft voice whenever he seemed anxious, until the doctor smiled and said that everything was stable and progressing well, and that the boy could go home with a lollipop as his reward for being brave. What Nova didn't know was that Silvio, who had been trying to reach her all morning to talk about the new developments, and about the cold distance still standing between them since the meeting at the attorney's office, had traced her path and come to the hospital hoping to speak with his wife. But when he stepped into the area near the waiting room and saw the scene before him, he stopped at the threshold and didn't take another step, only standing there quietly and watching from a distance, because what he saw left him speechless. He saw Nova, the woman the whole city was smearing as a greedy schemer, kneeling down to meet a little boy at eye level, straightening his collar and wiping an anxious tear from his cheek with unconditional tenderness, laughing with him to drive away his fear, fully present in that moment with the child as if nothing else in the world mattered more. Silvio stood there, leaning against the doorframe, and for the first time he saw the true person his wife was within the very world where she belonged, not the wife in a party dress among the cold rooms of the family estate, but a soul driven by pure, protective instincts, a woman who gave love without calculating what she would receive in return, a woman whose kindness wasn't a strategy or a mask, but the deepest nature of who she was. In that quiet moment, all the vague doubts that had slipped into his heart after the meeting at the attorney's office, all the cracks in trust that had kept him awake at night, suddenly dissolved like fog beneath the sun, because he understood that whatever Nova had hidden from him, whatever secrets about the past she carried inside her, the woman he was witnessing here couldn't possibly be the person those articles were trying to draw, couldn't possibly be someone who had entered his life with cold calculations. He remembered the moment when he had looked at her with astonishment instead of certainty on that night in the mansion, and a deep remorse rose inside him, because now he realized how terribly wrong he had been to let even a flicker of doubt touch this woman. Silvio didn't step forward, didn't interrupt the sacred moment between Nova and the boy. He only quietly stepped back and left the hospital in silence, carrying with him a new understanding and a strengthened resolve that he would never allow himself to doubt her again, and that when the right moment came, he would tell her everything his heart was carrying, would confess his blindness, and beg her for the chance to become the man she and their child deserved to have. A few days later, while the wave of public reaction to the video had still not settled, and the name Colette Marsh was still being spoken everywhere, Nova received a call from an unknown number, and on the other end came the trembling, broken voice of an elderly man who introduced himself as Ambrose Fletcher, someone who had once served as financial advisor to the Bellini family for many long years. He said he had watched her video, had heard her speak Colette's name, and that the name had awakened in him something he had tried to bury for 30 years, a burden of guilt he could no longer carry with him to the grave, and he asked to meet her somewhere discreet, a small, quiet bar tucked away in a hidden corner of the city, a place no one in the Bellini family's circle ever visited. Weston Doyle had warned Nova to be extremely careful and advised that Silvio shouldn't be present at this meeting, to preserve the objectivity of whatever Ambrose might reveal. And so, in the late afternoon, Nova stepped into that dim little bar, where old wooden tables sat silently beneath pale yellow lights, and she immediately recognized the man hunched in the corner, a thin old gentleman with a face deeply carved by time and by torment, his shaking hands resting on a large brown envelope. When Nova sat down across from him, Ambrose lifted his eyes to her, and his gaze went briefly still when he saw her face, as if he were looking at a ghost returned from the past, and he whispered that she had her mother's eyes, that same quiet resilience so much like Colette that it made his heart ache. But the moment he placed his hand on the envelope to push it toward her, Ambrose suddenly froze, his hand trembling as he pulled it back, and he lowered his head and whispered that he couldn't, that he was old now, that the people in the shadows of that family still had power, and he was afraid for the few final days he had left, afraid that opening his mouth and speaking this truth would bring consequences he no longer had the strength to bear. Nova didn't press him. She only sat quietly across from the man being torn apart from within, and with the gentle calm she had learned through years of sitting beside the beds of terrified patients, she placed her hand over his old, trembling one and said she understood his fear, that she hadn't come here to force him to do anything against his conscience. But she also softly reminded him that some burdens, the longer they are carried, the more they crush a person's soul from the inside. It was in that moment that Ambrose's eyes accidentally fell to Nova's pregnant belly, and something inside him broke open, because the sight of this young pregnant woman sitting before him with such quiet courage carried him back to a memory from 30 years earlier, when he had once sat across from another pregnant woman with the very same resilient eyes, and he had chosen cowardly silence instead of standing up to protect her. He began to cry, tears rolling down the wrinkled face of a man who had lived too long with remorse, and he said through his sobs that he couldn't let that happen one more time, that he had been a coward once, and that cowardice had haunted him for the rest of his life, and he wouldn't carry another death in his conscience down into the grave. With hands that had stopped shaking, as though the decision itself had lifted the weight that had pressed on his shoulders for so many years, Ambrose pushed the brown envelope toward Nova, and said that inside were copies of internal minutes from the meetings long ago, original documents that had never been altered or erased, documents he had secretly kept all these years as a kind of insurance for his conscience, pages that recorded exactly what had been discussed and decided behind closed doors about the fate of Colette Marsh and her company. Nova took the envelope with trembling hands, feeling the weight of the papers inside as if it were the weight of an entire truth buried for 3 decades, and she looked into the tear-filled eyes of the old man before her, seeing in them not only fear, but also the deep relief of a soul that had finally dared to face its own mistake. And she softly thanked him, not for the documents, but for the courage he had found again at the most important moment. Nova was about to open the envelope to look at the documents inside, when Ambrose gently placed his hand on it to stop her, saying that before she read what was written there was something he needed to say with his own mouth, something no page of paper could ever express, and his voice sank into a heaviness that made it seem as though he was preparing to set down a stone he had carried on his shoulders his entire life. He said the story of Colette Marsh wasn't simply the story of a company being taken over, or a woman being driven to the end of the road by debt. It went far deeper than that. and it was far more painful, because her mother had once been loved, and the man who loved her had been Julian Vance, the man your mother-in-law, Rosalind, had loved fiercely in her youth before she was traded into the Bellini Empire for power. Julian Vance was a man entirely outside the Bellini bloodline, an innocent merchant who only wanted a simple life with Colette. He was the only man Rosalind ever truly cared for. He said it hadn't been a passing affair or an act of exploitation, but a real love, deep and fierce. A love that crossed every boundary of class and every calculation of power, and that the man had loved Colette with all his heart, in a way he had never loved anyone else, sparking a lethal jealousy in Rosalind, who could not bear to see her former love find pure happiness with another woman. But that very love had become the seed of tragedy. Because when Colette discovered the hidden wrongdoing in the way the Bellini family had seized her family's company, when she began asking questions and trying to expose the truth, she became a threat. The people who held power in the shadows couldn't tolerate, and one name rose above the others as the person most determined to remove her. Ambrose stopped, his shoulders trembling. Then he finally spoke the thing he had kept buried for 30 years, that at the time Colette was forced to sign away everything and vanish from the city in loneliness and humiliation. She had not been alone at all. She was carrying a life inside her. She was pregnant, and that tiny life was Nova, the woman sitting before him now. The words fell into the stillness of the bar like silent thunder, and Nova felt as if the ground beneath her had collapsed, her breath caught in her chest, because in that horrifying moment, a terrible truth rose before her in all its cruelty, an eerie mirroring between her mother's fate 30 years earlier and her own fate now. She realized she was repeating every step her mother had taken. A pregnant woman being pressured by a powerful family to sign a paper giving everything up and disappear so she wouldn't stain their distinguished name, and the person who had sat in the gray stone mansion, pushing the paper toward her with the pen laid down like a loaded gun. That powerful woman might well have been the same person who had done something similar to her mother 30 years before. Nova raised a hand to cover her mouth, her whole body trembling as the final pieces locked into place inside her mind, as she understood that what was happening to her wasn't a random coincidence, but the deliberate repetition of a crime, a brutal cycle staged by the same hand across 2 generations, trying to erase 2 defenseless mothers to be simply because they dared to stand straight and refused to vanish in silence. Ambrose looked at her with tear-filled eyes and said that was exactly why he couldn't stay silent any longer. Because when he watched her video and realized she was pregnant, he had seen the whole old tragedy repeating itself before his eyes, and he couldn't bear the thought that history would happen again, that one more brave woman would be crushed in the same way while he sat still and watched, just as he had done before. Nova sat in silence for a long while, letting the shock sink into every fiber of her body, and inside that stunned stillness, she felt something both painful and strangely connected, because now she understood that her fight was no longer only her own, but the continuation of a fight her mother had begun 30 years earlier and had not lived long enough to finish, and that the child in her womb, the 3rd bloodline caught in this tragic cycle, would be the first one with a chance to break it and be born in the light of truth instead of the darkness of fear. The next morning, Nova brought the brown envelope Ambrose had given her to Weston Doyle's office, her heart still in turmoil from the horrifying truth about the 30-year cycle she had just uncovered. And when she placed the internal meeting minutes on his desk and began telling him what Ambrose had revealed about her mother's love affair and about how Colette had been pregnant when she was forced to disappear, she noticed something change in the old attorney's face. Weston didn't look surprised the way he should have. He only quietly removed his thick glasses, rubbed the bridge of his tired nose with his fingers, and sat in silence for a long time, wearing a heaviness that made it seem as if his whole body were being pressed down by an invisible weight. And it was that strange silence that made Nova suddenly understand what she had dimly sensed from their very first meeting, that this man knew too much, knew even the smallest details with a precision no mere friend of her mother's could possibly have possessed. She looked straight at him and softly asked what else he had not told her, and Weston lifted his eyes, his aged gaze glistening with tears after so many years of silence. Then, in a hoarse, broken voice, he began to confess the thing he had carried in torment for 3 decades. He said that 30 years ago, he had not been the old attorney with a cane sitting here helping her search for justice, but a young and ambitious lawyer working for the Bellini family, and that it was his own hands, his own pen, that had drafted that cruel document, the paper that stripped Colette Marsh of both her livelihood and her dignity, and forced her to sign it in the most desperate moment of her life. Nova felt as if someone had struck her in the chest. She drew back in her chair, and for a moment, anger rose and lodged in her throat, because the man she had trusted, the man she had believed was her mother's only ally, had been one of the people who helped destroy her life. But Weston didn't avoid the anger in her eyes. He received it as though receiving a punishment he deserved, and he continued through tears, saying that back then he had been young, blinded by ambition and money, and he had told himself he was only doing the work assigned to him, that the words he wrote were only legal procedure and not a crime, until he witnessed the consequences of what he had done and realized he had helped push an innocent woman toward death. He said what tormented him most through all the years was that Colette had never known his role in her tragedy, that until the day she closed her eyes, she had never known that the young lawyer standing quietly behind the meeting table that year was the one who had drafted the paper that ruined her life, and she had gone without ever cursing him, without ever knowing of that silent betrayal, and the innocence in her eyes had become the heaviest sentence ever passed on his conscience. Weston said that after Colette died, he could no longer keep living as before, that he left the Bellini family, gave up the path of prestige opening wide before him, and devoted the rest of his life to atoning for his mistake, deliberately reaching out to Nova under the guise of an old acquaintance to provide her with a safety net and protect her through the years, gathering and preserving every piece of evidence possible while waiting for the day justice could be done. All of it in the dark, without claiming credit, without asking to be forgiven. He said he didn't dare ask for her forgiveness, because he knew some sins were too great to be forgiven. But he begged her to give him the chance to complete the only thing still meaningful in his guilty life, which was to help her bring the truth into the light and return to her mother the name and dignity that he himself had helped take away. Nova sat in silence for a very long time, torn between anger and something deeper. And when she looked into the tear-filled eyes of the old man, who had spent 30 years of his life quietly atoning for one mistake, she realized that true repentance required more courage than innocence, that a person who dared to face the worst of his own sin and spend the rest of his life trying to repair it deserved to be given a chance, and she gave a small nod, telling him in a choked voice that her mother would surely have wanted the truth exposed more than she would have wanted him to keep sinking into the darkness of guilt, and that Nova chose to trust him, not because the past could be changed, but because the future could still be saved. That night, as Silvio sat alone in the study with the internal meeting minutes Nova had shared with him, trying to arrange in his mind everything he had just learned about his father's love, about the brutal cycle that had stretched across 30 years, his phone rang, and Rosalind's name appearing on the screen made him hesitate for a moment before answering. His mother's voice came through the line, and at once he recognized the familiar tone she used whenever she was preparing to strike, with a carefully calculated psychological blow, that dangerously sweet voice, soft as velvet but hiding a blade inside. And she began by saying that she knew he was digging too deeply into matters that should have been left alone, that she wasn't calling to argue, but because she was his mother and couldn't stand by while he destroyed himself with his own hands. Rosalind told him in a low, calculating murmur that if he kept dragging this past into the light, the first thing burned to ash wouldn't be her, but the legacy of the father he had worshipped, because once everything was exposed, the whole city would look at his father's empire not as a monument of greatness, but as a house built on corruption, and the Bellini name, the name generations had bled to build, would become a symbol of disgrace on everyone's lips. She continued tightening the psychological vice, saying that he thought he was fighting for justice. But in truth, he was holding a torch to the very house that had raised him, that his unborn child would grow up, not in the glory of a distinguished bloodline, but in the ashes of a fallen empire, carrying a family name that had been stained, all because of the blind stubbornness of a father who wanted to play the hero. She said she had spent her entire life protecting this family, keeping dark secrets buried exactly where they belonged. And she had done it not for herself, but for him, for his future, and for his child's future, and that if he still had even a little gratitude or a little wisdom left, he would stop now, bring his wife home, settle everything quietly, and let the dead rest in peace. Silvio sat silently and listened to everything his mother said, and as she spoke, he realized that only a few months earlier, perhaps those words could have moved him, could have made him falter out of fear of staining his father's memory, and under the weight of responsibility to the family name. But now, after everything he had seen and understood, Those words only sounded like the hollow echo of a power thrashing in desperation. He answered his mother in a voice that was strangely calm, without a trace of anger, only with the certainty of a man who had finally seen everything clearly. He said she was mistaken if she thought his family's memory would be destroyed by the truth, because a man like Julian Vance, who had truly loved and been prevented from protecting the woman he loved, deserved compassion more than condemnation, and that the only thing that had truly disgraced the Bellini name wasn't that pure love, but the crime committed to tear it apart. He told her that the problem had never been Nova, had never been his father, had never been the past she feared so deeply, but her own inability to defeat a woman who had never wanted to fight, a quiet woman who possessed a dignity that all the money and power of the Bellini family could never buy. Rosalind fell silent on the other end of the line, and inside that silence, Silvio could feel the cold fury rising within her, but he didn't let it shake him. He went on, saying that for the past 3 years, he had tried to bring this family out of the darkness, and now he understood that path could never be completed, while a buried crime still rotted the foundation of everything. He stood, walked to the window, and looked out at Lake Michigan, black beneath the moonlight, and with his final words before ending the call, he told his mother that he had made his choice, that he wouldn't handle this in the way of darkness as she wanted, wouldn't use power to silence or threaten or arrange things quietly, but would pull everything into the light, whatever the price might be, because he wanted his son to be born into a family brave enough to face the truth, not into an empire built on silent graves. On the night before the confrontation that both of them knew would change everything, Silvio came to the small apartment in Pilsen, and this time he did not come as a powerful boss, or as a husband trying to repair everything with money, but simply as a man standing before the door with empty hands and a heart finally ready to be honest. Nova opened the door and saw him standing there beneath the yellow hallway light, looking worn down, yet with something different in his eyes, and she silently stepped aside to let him into the warm space where everything still carried traces of her mother, the small world where she belonged, and where he had always stood at the edge. They sat across from each other at the wooden table, and for a long while neither of them said anything. There was only the groan of the old elevator somewhere in the building, and the quiet hum of the radiator keeping the cold winter night at bay, until Nova was the one who broke the silence, because she understood that if they still wanted a future, then tonight every wall between them had to come down. She told him, her voice soft but not trembling, that she owed him a truth she had kept hidden for too long, and she admitted that she had kept a heavy secret shortly after their marriage, instead of the complete openness he had always believed, that not long after the wedding she had accidentally discovered the name Marsh in his family's papers, and from that moment on, she had quietly investigated her mother's death, carrying suspicions and secrets inside her that she had not dared share even with her own husband. She said she had been afraid, numbingly afraid, that if he knew she was digging into his family's past, he would think she had used him, that her love was only a disguise for revenge, and that fear had kept her silent, even as that silence was killing their marriage from the inside. Silvio listened to every word without interrupting, and when she finished speaking, he did not look angry or betrayed as she had feared. Instead, he lowered his head for a long time, then lifted it again with reddened eyes, and he said that he was the one who needed to apologize. He confessed his blindness, that for all these years he had lived inside the world of his family without once truly looking at its shadows, that he had been too occupied with running the empire and taking those distant trips while leaving her alone to endure his mother's cruelty, that he had been the kind of man who was always somewhere else at the exact moment she needed him most. He told her about the moment he had stood silently at the hospital doorway and watched her care for Milo, and about how that very moment had driven every doubt from his heart, had shown him who she truly was more clearly than any explanation ever could, and he said he didn't need her to prove her love, because he had seen it in the way she lived, in her boundless empathy, in the quiet courage with which she faced an entire empire. Nova felt the tears she had held back for so long finally slide down her face. Not tears of pain, but of a deep relief, because for the first time since everything had begun, she no longer had to carry the weight of the secret alone, and she reached across the table to take his hand, feeling the familiar warmth she had thought she was about to lose. They sat together like that for a long time in the silent apartment, speaking of her mother, of his father, of the brutal cycle they were about to break together, and of the child soon to be born who would become the beginning of something entirely different. And inside that honest conversation, The cold distance that had risen between them since the meeting at the attorney's office slowly dissolved, replaced by a new and stronger bond, the kind that can only be forged when two people dare to show each other the weakest and most wounded parts of themselves. Before he left, Silvio placed his hand on her pregnant belly and whispered to their unborn child that he would be born in truth, and Nova looked at him, understanding that whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together as a real family, with no more secrets, no more walls, only two people who had chosen to stand on the same side in the fight to reclaim dignity for the people they loved. Early the next morning, before the confrontation took place, Nova and Silvio sat together decoding the small piece of paper Colette had hidden in the secret compartment behind the face of the compass necklace. And as they followed the numbers and symbols written in her mother's careful handwriting, they realized that it was pointing them toward an old safe hidden inside a personal property storage warehouse. The Bellini family had long since forgotten a safe that, according to Silvio, had once belonged privately to his father, and that no one had been allowed to touch after his death. The notes revealed that Silvio's father had secretly given Colette these coordinates, a desperate final act to ensure she could one day claim the truth if something ever happened to him. This proved that the secret alliance between her and Silvio's father had been far deeper than they had imagined, rooted not in romance, but in his profound guilt and a desperate wish to protect her from his family's greed, that the man must have trusted her enough to share even his most private secrets, and that somehow Colette had deliberately left this clue for her daughter, as if she knew that one day the truth would need to be found there. With Weston's help, since he still kept the papers allowing access to the storage warehouse, they went there and opened the old safe, thick with the dust of time, and inside, among yellowed financial documents and a few personal keepsakes, Silvio found something that seemed to stop his heart, an unposted letter written in his father's own handwriting, addressed to Rosalind, the definitive proof that locked their investigation into place. With trembling hands, he laid his father's final words alongside the evidence they had gathered, staring at the long-buried truth of Colette Marsh and Julian Vance that now stood absolute and undeniable, ready to shatter the family's cruel myth once and for all. As his eyes scanned the faded ink, each line gradually unraveled the reality about the patriarch he thought he knew. In that letter, the man who had once stood at the head of the Bellini family was not a cold conqueror, but a human being torn apart by conscience and love, a father trying to repair a terrible crime his family had committed. His father wrote that he could no longer live with the guilt of what Rosalind and the family had done to Colette Marsh and to her family's company, that he had decided to return everything, to give Marsh and Vessel back to its lawful heirs, to publicly reveal the whole truth about how the family had seized it, even if doing so destroyed the reputation and the empire he had worked so hard to build, because, he wrote, no fortune was worth trading for a person's soul. He wrote of Colette's ruin with a deep guilt and remorse that made Silvio choke up, wrote that he knew he had allowed his family's greed and his wife's jealousy over Julian to destroy an innocent woman, that he had been a corporate coward when he had not found the courage to stop the injustice and protect an innocent competitor in time, and that returning the company and exposing the truth was the least he could do to atone for some part of that wrong, even though he knew it had come far too late. But what left Silvio numb with shock was not the contents of the letter, but the date written in the upper corner of the page, because when he looked at that date, he realized with icy horror that this letter had been written only a few days before the fateful night his father suddenly died, the night the whole family had accepted as a heart attack delivered by fate. Silvio's whole body went cold as the final pieces clicked into place inside his mind, as he realized that his father had died right before the moment he intended to make the truth public and return everything, that a healthy man had suddenly fallen exactly when he became the greatest threat to those who wanted the secret kept buried. And that coincidence was so cruel, he could no longer believe it was only chance. He did not say aloud the thought taking shape in his mind, the terrible suspicion that his father's death might not have been as natural as everyone had said. But when he lifted his eyes to Nova, she had already read all of it in his gaze, and she gripped his hand in silence, sharing this new and horrifying grief with him. Silvio sank down beside the old safe, holding his father's unfinished letter against his chest, and for the first time since he had been a little boy, he let the tears fall, mourning the father he had only now truly come to understand, a man who had tried to do what was right, and perhaps had paid for that courage with his own life. And inside that choking grief, something in Silvio was forged into steel, because now the battle tomorrow was no longer only about restoring Colette's dignity or protecting Nova, but about completing the unfinished wish his father had not lived long enough to fulfill. About finally bringing into the light the truth he had been ready to sacrifice everything to expose. The showdown was held inside a vast warehouse by the docks, only a few blocks from the ruined building of Marsh and Vessel, a place Silvio had deliberately chosen because he wanted the truth to be exposed on the very ground where the crime had begun, on the land that had witnessed the collapse of an honest family. In the cold, echoing space of the warehouse, chairs had been arranged in rows, and one by one, the most important people entered, the elders of the Bellini family with stern faces and searching eyes, and alongside them the legitimate business partners whose relationship Silvio had worked so hard to build over the past 3 years, investors and heads of respected transportation corporations, who had seen in Bellini only a logistics empire rising cleanly into the light. Nova sat in the front row in a simple pale dress, her mother's compass necklace worn proudly at her throat, and she radiated a deep calm that no one in the room could mistake for weakness, one hand resting protectively over her pregnant belly, as if she wanted her child to witness the moment when the truth was finally brought into the light. Rosalind entered last, slowly and regally, removing her soft leather gloves with her familiar arrogance, and she swept her eyes across the room with a contemptuous smile, asking in a cold voice whether the running of the family had now been replaced by a cheap emotional performance, staged by an unstable pregnant girl, trying to use disdain to seize control from the very beginning. But Silvio did not allow her to continue. He stood in the middle of the room with the calm of a man who had prepared for this moment with his whole heart, and he began to speak, not in the voice of a boss giving orders, but in the voice of a son who had finally dared to look directly at the truth about his own family. He declared to everyone present that they had been summoned here today to face a crime that had been buried for 30 years, a crime committed by the Bellini family itself. And then he called his first witness forward. Ambrose Fletcher, though his body was frail and his hands still trembled, walked into the center of the room with the help of his cane, defying the fear that had weighed on him for 3 decades, and in a broken but clear voice, he recounted the whole truth of what had happened inside closed rooms long ago, about how a cold decision had been made to crush an innocent woman and steal her family's livelihood. A murmur spread through the warehouse, the family elders beginning to shift uneasily, and a few voices rose in protest. One elderly man shot to his feet, pointed at Ambrose, called him a traitor, and tried to lunge forward, but Silvio's guards quietly stopped him and guided him back to his seat without letting anything go too far. And Silvio, his gaze so firm that the entire room gradually fell silent. Then Weston Doyle stepped forward, and as the man who had once drafted those sinful documents with his own hands, he placed on the table at the center of the room all the unaltered internal minutes Ambrose had preserved, papers recording the shadowed transactions, the loans arranged so they could later be called in, and even the chilling marginal notes saying that Colette Marsh needed to be forced to leave permanently before the transfer could be completed. The legitimate business partners began passing copies of the documents from hand to hand, and Nova could see their faces changing little by little, from doubt to horror, as they realized that the empire they had trusted and tied their names to had been built on a foundation of crime that dark. Then came the moment Silvio had been waiting for. He looked to Nova, and she stood, unclasping the brass compass from her throat and laying it on the table alongside the unposted letter of Silvio's late father. There was no need for dramatic gestures. The authority of the handwriting spoke for itself. Before the stunned eyes of the assembly, the legacy of the late patriarch was laid bare, revealing a definitive command to return the company and expose the truth. As the letter of the family's founder, a man the elders had once feared and worshipped, was read aloud, a stunned silence fell over the room. No one could deny the truth any longer. Written in his own hand, the head of the empire had clearly admitted to the family's sins and declared his determination to right the wrong. In that breathless stillness, one legitimate business partner after another stood, and their spokesperson, a woman who led one of the largest corporations, declared in a cold and decisive voice that they could not and would not continue attaching their names to an organization that had concealed such a crime, that every partnership and every investment would be withdrawn immediately until a full, independent investigation had been carried out. One by one, they gathered their papers and walked out of the warehouse, and with every departing step, Nova saw the power Rosalind had held and protected all her life disintegrating before her eyes, not through violence or revenge, but through the undeniable weight of truth finally dragged into the light. When the warehouse door closed behind the last partner, and their footsteps faded into the cold emptiness of the docks, Rosalind still sat motionless in her chair, but the flawless shell of arrogance she had worn for so many years began to crack before the eyes of everyone left in the room. She suddenly sprang up from her seat, and for the first time in her life, her icy composure shattered into a storm of desperate fury. She turned toward Silvio and Nova with eyes streaked by the fire of an animal driven into a corner, and she began to speak, the words pouring out no longer controlled by her usual cold calculation, but by something far more naked and painful. She said she had been the only one who kept this family from falling apart, that while Julian was lost in his blind infatuation with an ordinary woman from the docks, she had been the one forced to carry everything, the one forced to make the cruel decisions no one else had the courage to make, the one forced to dirty her hands so the entire family could survive and rise. Her voice broke as she went on, and in those bitter words, the fear that had eaten away at her all her life finally came into view. She confessed to living for decades with a terrible obsession she was trapped in a cold, arranged marriage, and that Colette Marsh, that poor woman without a single distinguished coin to her name, had possessed the very thing Rosalind could never have. Even with all the money and power of the Bellini family, a fierce, genuine love from Julian, and a quiet dignity that nothing could buy. She said she had hated Colette, not because Colette was a threat to the company, but because every time she looked at her, she saw her own failure reflected back, saw that everything she had traded her whole life to obtain, the name, the position, the empire, became meaningless before a woman who had nothing but self-respect. And it was that fear of being the replacement, the second choice, the one who was unloved, that had turned her into the person she had become. Nova rose and walked closer to the woman who was breaking apart, and everyone in the room held their breath, waiting to see what she would do. Whether she would pour down on Rosalind all the anger and hatred that had been building after everything Rosalind had done to her and to her mother. But when Nova spoke, her voice held no hatred, and not even a trace of pity. She looked straight into Rosalind's eyes and said in a voice soft but so clear it echoed through the room that Rosalind had had a choice, that in her fear and pain, she could have chosen to stand against the men who had oppressed and belittled her, the men who had arranged her life and never loved her. But instead she had chosen to crush a defenseless pregnant woman, and then 30 years later, she had plotted to do that exact cruelty once more to her own daughter-in-law. Nova said Rosalind had spent her life becoming the very kind of person who had destroyed her, and that was the greatest tragedy of all, that she could have broken the cycle but chose to continue it, could have found compassion for a woman suffering the same fate, but chose cruelty instead. And she said she wasn't standing here to judge Rosalind's soul, but she would never again let her take away her mother's dignity, or anyone else's. Rosalind staggered backward, her face deathly pale, and in that moment, she no longer looked like a terrifying and powerful matriarch, but only like an old and lonely woman facing the collapse of her entire life. One of the family elders, his voice trembling with outrage, spoke up and suggested that this matter had to be settled the family way, in darkness, to protect the Bellini name, hinting at the brutal methods the underworld still used to erase problems. But Silvio snapped around and cut him off in a steel-hard voice that allowed no argument. He declared before everyone that there would be no more darkness, no revenge, no bought silence, no other crime committed to cover old crimes, that this matter would be brought into the light and resolved through real justice, not the laws of the underworld. And he looked straight at the elders, bowing their heads, and said that if the value of this empire had been built on a buried injustice, then it had been rotten for a long time, and wasn't worth protecting for even one more day. In the days after the confrontation, as news of the partners' withdrawal and the independent investigation began to spread, Nova received a call from Delphine Kerr, the very reporter who had once written the article smearing her under Rosalind's orders, but this time the woman's voice had changed, sweet and softened, full of the false remorse of someone who had sensed that the wind had shifted. Delphine asked to meet Nova, saying that she had realized her mistake and now wanted to atone by writing an article exposing the whole truth, and she hinted that if Nova handed over the documents and evidence in her possession, she could turn Rosalind Bellini into someone the entire city would spit on, could destroy that woman's reputation completely, could ruin her name, and leave her unable to lift her head ever again. A perfect revenge placed directly into Nova's hands. Nova sat quietly and listened to that offer. And for a moment, she felt its temptation, because a part of her, the part that had carried pain and resentment through all those months, The part that had entered this marriage with a smoldering question about her mother's death and a secret longing to reclaim justice. That part longed to see Rosalind pay, to witness the woman who had tried to erase both her mother and her being crushed beneath the very weapon she had used. This was the moment Nova had silently been moving toward since the first day she discovered the name Marsh in her husband's family papers. The moment when the truth finally lay entirely in her hands, and she had the full power to decide whether she would use it to heal or to destroy, and she understood that the choice she made now would define who she was forever. But when she closed her eyes and searched inside herself for the answer, she did not think of Rosalind. She thought of her mother, of the gentle woman who had told her daughter to find her own true north and never lower her head before people who confused a grand family name with real dignity, and she understood that her mother would never want her to become a destroyer in order to claim justice. She thought of Milo with his innocent smile and his drawing of 3 people holding hands beneath a bright yellow sun, thought of the child growing inside her, and she realized that if she chose the path of revenge, if she chose to use the truth like a knife, to cut another person's life to pieces, no matter how much that person might deserve it, then she would only be continuing the cruel cycle she had fought to break, only becoming another version of the very darkness she hated. And so Nova opened her eyes, and in a calm yet unwavering voice, she refused Delphine's offer, telling the reporter that she didn't need an article to destroy anyone, that the truth had already been brought before the people who needed to know it, and would be judged by real justice, not by the court of public opinion and humiliation, and that she had walked this whole road, not to destroy the Bellini family, but to restore her mother's name and dignity, and that had been done. When she set the phone down, she felt a deep relief spreading through her body, because in that moment of refusal, the conflict that had torn at her for so many months, the contradiction between the loving wife and the daughter searching for the truth, between love and revenge, had finally been resolved. And she understood that she had chosen the true north her mother had always wanted for her. A few days later, on a quiet afternoon, Rosalind unexpectedly appeared at the door of the small apartment in Pilsen, no longer wrapped in smoke-gray silk or expensive jewelry, but wearing only a simple black dress, looking smaller and far older than the powerful woman Nova had once faced inside the gray stone mansion. She stood there for a long while, her eyes moving across the warm room before stopping on the framed photograph of Colette Marsh, smiling brightly on the table, and without offering a single excuse, without one word of defense for what she had done, she only quietly reached into her pocket and took out a small object, placing it on the table before Nova with trembling hands. It was an old employee badge, faded by the years, Colette Marsh's dock access badge from long ago, with the black and white photograph of a young woman with resilient eyes and a gentle smile, a small piece of the past that Rosalind had kept for 30 years like a trophy of control. And now she set it down as one final surrender, returning the last fragment of the woman she had tried to erase, then turned and walked out of the apartment in silence, leaving Nova sitting there, holding her mother's badge as tears quietly fell. 3 months later, on a late winter night when a great storm swept down over Chicago, and howling winds lashed bursts of sleet against the windows, Nova felt the first contractions telling her that her child was ready to enter this world. And in that moment, the only worry that passed through her mind was not about the pain ahead, but whether Silvio would make it back to her in time. But she did not have to worry for long, because Silvio, the man who had once always been somewhere else in the most important moments, the man who had entered her life with distant trips and long absences, was now beside her from the very first second, and he drove her to the hospital through the curtain of snow with the calm and determination of a man who had sworn to himself that this time he would never be late. In the warm and quiet delivery room of a small hospital, far from the noise of scandal and the investigation still unfolding outside, Silvio held Nova's hand tightly through every long hour, and he did not leave for even a moment, did not let a work call or anything else in the world pull him out of that room, only kept whispering beside her ear that he was here, that he wasn't going anywhere, that she was not alone. Nova looked into her husband's green eyes through the pain, and in those eyes, she no longer saw even the faintest shadow of the astonishment or hesitation that had once cracked her heart on that night inside the gray stone mansion. Only absolute certainty remained, a love with no doubt left inside it, and it was that which gave her the strength to endure the hardest moment. And then, as the storm outside slowly quieted and the first light of dawn began to rise beyond the window, a clear and healthy cry rang out, tearing through the stillness of the room, the first cry of a tiny life just welcomed into the world, and both Nova and Silvio broke down in tears. Tears of pure happiness that they had passed through so much darkness to reach. When the baby was placed in Nova's arms, she looked down at her son's red little face and his barely opened eyes, and she felt as if all the pain and loss of 3 generations had finally found redemption in this moment, because this child, unlike her mother and unlike Nova herself, would be born not into the darkness of fear and buried secrets, but into the full light of truth. Silvio bent down, one arm around his wife and one hand gently touching his son's tiny hand, and he whispered that this was exactly where he was meant to be, that no empire, no battle, nothing in the world mattered more than this moment, and he had kept the sacred promise he had made to himself, the promise that he would never again arrive too late. When they were asked for the baby's name, Nova looked at Silvio and he nodded to her, because they had spoken of this for a long time, and both of them knew what name their child had to carry, and she softly said that their son would be named Elias Marsh Bellini, a name carrying both bloodlines and both histories, with the middle name Marsh given proudly, so it would carry the strength of a woman who had fiercely refused to be erased, the grandmother the boy would never meet, but whose story would live forever in the very name he bore. Nova held her child against her chest, and softly sang the same lullaby her mother had once sung to her in the small apartment in Pilsen. And in that moment, she felt Colette's gentle presence as if she were smiling somewhere very near, as if through this child, the woman who had been forced to disappear 30 years earlier had finally come home, finally been allowed to hold her grandchild in the unseen arms of a love that outlived even death. Outside the window, the storm had completely passed, and the Chicago sky was brightening into the pale pink of early morning, and Silvio stood beside the bed watching his wife and son bathed in that warm light, understanding that the brutal cycle that had stretched across 3 generations, the cycle of women being crushed and truths being buried, had finally been broken forever by the birth of an innocent child, a pure new beginning built not on silent graves, but on the foundation of love, courage, and truth. 5 years had passed since the stormy night Elias was born, and the old docks where Marsh and Vessel had once been crushed in darkness had now been revived into something no one had ever dared to dream of, a vocational training center and scholarship fund named Marsh and Vessel, dedicated to lifting up the children of dock workers and low-income families, to give children born far from power the very chance Nova's mother had once been denied. The administrative building that had once been boarded up and rusted now blazed with light, its corridors ringing with laughter and the footsteps of young students learning a trade so they could stand firmly on their own feet, and on the most honored wall of the main hall hung a large black-and-white portrait of Colette Marsh, the woman with resilient eyes and the compass necklace at her throat, placed where everyone could see and remember her. Nova walked through the sun-filled main hall, holding the small hand of her son Elias, now 5 years old, with green eyes exactly like his father's, while Silvio followed behind carrying a stack of files and the coat the boy had forgotten, and the 3 of them stopped before the memorial wall, where Elias looked up, pointed at the portrait, and asked his mother if that was the grandmother he had never met. Nova knelt down to meet her son at eye level, gently touched the frame, and explained to him in a tender voice that his grandma Colette had left him a powerful story, a story so he would never feel small before anyone, and that no matter how wealthy people might be, they never had the right to look down on another person's dignity. That day marked the opening ceremony for the newly expanded scholarship program, and Nova had deliberately chosen to hold it not with glittering red carpets, but with a warm gathering of students, teachers, and working people. And among the first students to step forward and receive that scholarship was an 11-year-old boy with a radiant smile whom Nova recognized at once. It was Milo, the little boy from Pilsen, now grown strong and full of dreams. He ran to Nova and threw his arms around her with the gratitude of a child who had never forgotten the gentle protector of his earliest years. And when he stepped onto the stage to receive the fund's first scholarship, Nova looked at him with swelling pride, understanding that the healing embrace she had offered years ago was now spreading outward into new and beautiful things. As the ceremony concluded, Nova and Silvio stood in the private office, their eyes drifting to the framed portrait resting quietly on the desk. The serene gaze of a young Colette Marsh, captured decades ago in a moment of genuine happiness, now watched over the foundation built in her name, no longer a ghost of a hidden scandal, but a living symbol of dignity and reclaimed truth. Later that week, Silvio and Nova took the framed portrait to the quiet, secluded cottage outside the city where Rosalind now lived in self-imposed exile, away from the empire she had lost. They chose to stay in the car, letting little Elias carry the framed image up to the porch where his grandmother sat alone in a simple black cardigan. With the pure innocence of a child who did not yet understand the full weight of adult burdens, Elias gently placed the photograph in her hands, looked up into her weary gray eyes, and told her that she didn't have to look back anymore, and that they were all safe now. That simple sentence, combined with the image of a love she had once tried to destroy but was now beautifully restored, finally cracked the armor around her hardened heart. Watching through the window, Silvio and Nova saw Rosalind let out a long, trembling breath, tears finally spilling down her wrinkled cheeks as she pulled her grandson into a tight, silent embrace. In that poignant moment, Silvio knew that although the wounds would never completely heal, the poison that had infected his family for 3 generations was finally gone, replaced by a quiet path toward redemption. That afternoon, the family walked together along the rugged, rocky shoreline of the docks, the waves beating rhythmically against the shore, while Elias ran a few steps ahead, and Silvio draped a warm coat over Nova's shoulders, then looked back at the building, now standing bright and proud, like a monument to truth instead of lies. And they understood that they had passed through the deepest darkness together, to finally learn that real peace is never found by burying pain, but by having the courage to bring it into the light. The story of Nova and Silvio reminds us that the greatest legacy a person can leave for the next generation is not a fortune built on the silence and suffering of others, nor a name shielded beneath layers of lies, but the integrity to admit mistakes, the courage to seek forgiveness even when it comes late, and a heart that knows how to honor every person's dignity, whether they are rich or poor, because a family built on sincere respect and love will always endure longer than any empire built from fear and secrets. If this story has touched your heart, please press the subscribe button on our channel, like and share so we can listen together to many more meaningful and compelling stories every day. And we would truly love to know how you feel about Nova's story, so please leave a comment sharing the feelings from deep within your heart so we can hear your voice. Thank you for taking the time to stay with us until the very last lines. We wish everyone listening to this story good health, a joyful life, peace, and love every day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next videos.